Somewhere in the pitch-black waters of the Gulf of Oman, a massive supertanker is moving in total silence. Its tracking systems are dead. Its registry is obscured. On paper, this vessel simply does not exist. But deep within its hull lies the essential lifeblood of the world's second-largest economy. Millions of barrels of crude oil destined to keep the industrial engines of mainland China running. This is the Shadow Fleet. For years, this covert network of ghost ships allowed Beijing to quietly secure its energy needs while bypassing global sanctions. But the rules of the ocean have suddenly changed. Waiting in the dark isn't a rival fleet of pirates. It is the full weight of American naval deterrence and financial surveillance. What is unfolding in these narrow waters is not just a crackdown on smuggling. It is a quiet, high-stakes economic war that is actively redrawing the global balance of power. To understand the sheer scale of this maritime confrontation, you have to look at the industrial appetite driving it. China is the undisputed factory floor of the world, but that immense manufacturing capability rests on a highly fragile foundation, an insatiable, bottomless demand for foreign energy. Every logistics hub in Guangzhou, every steel mill in Hebei, and every high-tech assembly line relies on an uninterrupted daily flow of imported crude. And a massive portion of that flow originates from the Persian Gulf. For years, the strategic alliance between Beijing and Tehran seemed like a perfect marriage of convenience. Iran possesses some of the world's largest oil reserves, but remains heavily restricted from the conventional global market by a suffocating web of United States sanctions. China needs cheap oil to maintain its industrial edge, and it possesses the alternative financial architecture to bypass Western banking regulations. The result was a highly lucrative underground energy pipeline flowing directly from Iranian terminals to independent Chinese refineries. But there is a geographic catch. To move millions of barrels of crude from the Persian Gulf to the South China Sea, every single drop must navigate a narrow, intensely monitored body of water, the Strait of Hormuz. It is the inescapable bottleneck of the global energy trade. If you want to understand the hidden mechanisms driving global conflict, make sure to subscribe. We break down the realities of modern geopolitics without the noise. For a long time, Washington either tolerated or struggled to contain this clandestine trade. But the strategic calculus has shifted. Before we look at how the American military and financial apparatus is actively dismantling this network, we have to examine the mechanical reality of how these ghost ships actually operate. The Shadow Fleet is not a formal armada flying a single flag. It is a highly decentralized, constantly mutating network of aging tankers operating entirely outside standard maritime regulations. These vessels are typically massive crude carriers nearing the end of their operational lifespans, ships that traditional shipping conglomerates would normally scrap. Instead, they are purchased through complex layers of anonymous shell companies registered in jurisdictions with notoriously lax corporate transparency. Once a ship is quietly absorbed into this clandestine network, it effectively vanishes from the legitimate, heavily regulated global economy. The most fundamental tactic in their evasion playbook is digital invisibility. Under international maritime law, commercial vessels are strictly required to continuously broadcast their location, heading, and identity using the Automatic Identification System, or AIS. Shadow Fleet captains routinely violate this mandate, simply turning their transponders completely off as they approach sanctioned Iranian loading terminals. More sophisticated operators elevate this deception by engaging in AIS spoofing, a practice where the ship's hardware is manipulated to broadcast false GPS coordinates. A digital tracker might show a supertanker sitting idly in a safe harbor, while the physical vessel is actually taking on hundreds of thousands of barrels under the cover of darkness. But successfully loading the sanctioned oil is only the first phase of the operation. To further obfuscate the origin of the crude, these networks rely heavily on high-stakes ship-to-ship transfers conducted in the open ocean, often in international waters off the coast of Malaysia or within the Gulf of Oman. Two massive tankers will carefully tie up alongside each other, stretching heavy pressurized hoses across their steel decks to pump millions of gallons of crude from a sanctioned ship into a completely clean, outwardly legitimate vessel. This high-risk maneuver effectively launders the cargo, masking its Iranian origin long before it approaches the Chinese coastline. The infrastructure supporting these physical maneuvers is deeply rooted in alternative financial systems. legitimate maritime trade is entirely underpinned by major Western insurance markets, primarily based in London, which strictly refuse to cover vessels violating United States Treasury sanctions. In response, the Shadow Fleet operates entirely without standard protection and indemnity insurance. They rely instead on a volatile patchwork of obscure state-backed guarantees or opaque private syndicates that offer highly questionable coverage in the event of an oil spill or collision. For the dark fleet operators, the astronomical profit margins easily outweigh the localized environmental risks. The sheer scale of this logistical evasion is difficult to overstate. At its peak, this invisible supply chain has successfully moved upwards of 1 million barrels of oil every single day, quietly generating billions of dollars in illicit revenue for Tehran while securing discounted energy for Beijing. It is a masterful, continuously adapting choreography of digital deception, maritime risk, and corporate anonymity. The system is designed specifically to keep the industrial heartland of China beating despite international pressure, creating a massive loophole in the global sanctions regime. Yet, for all its structural ingenuity, this network possesses a fatal, unavoidable flaw. No matter how intricate the financial structuring or how advanced the digital spoofing becomes, these massive vessels cannot alter the physical geography of the Middle East. They are towering, slow-moving structures of steel that absolutely require specific deep-water channels to sail. To reach the open ocean, this entire network of evasion must eventually funnel through the exact same narrow geographic window, bringing them directly into the operational theater of the United States Navy. The Strait of Hormuz is not merely a geographic feature. It is the ultimate choke point of the modern industrial world. Connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and the broader Arabian Sea, this narrow passage acts as the central artery for roughly 1/5 of global oil consumption. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are restricted to just 2 miles wide in either direction. For the Shadow Fleet attempting to transport Iranian crude, there is simply no alternate physical route, no pipeline capacity vast enough, and no overland logistical network capable of matching the immense volume carried by a single supertanker. This physical restriction strips away the advantages of corporate anonymity. When a massive vessel stretching longer than 3 football fields enters the strait, its digital tricks become entirely irrelevant. You cannot hide a structure of that magnitude in a confined body of water, especially when the surrounding environment is under constant, overlapping military surveillance. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered nearby in Bahrain, maintains a formidable and highly visible presence, specifically designed to secure these critical waterways. Operating in these waters means navigating a highly dense, continuously monitored security environment. It involves more than just physical warships patrolling the horizon. It is a layered network of advanced sensors, radar installations, maritime patrol aircraft, and unmanned aerial systems constantly sweeping the surface. Every significant movement is tracked, recorded, and analyzed. When a tanker shuts off its AIS transponder approaching the Gulf, that sudden digital silence immediately flags the vessel for intense physical scrutiny. The disappearance of a ship from the civilian grid often guarantees its appearance on a military radar screen. The presence of American naval power here serves a dual purpose. It ensures the free flow of legitimate global commerce while simultaneously maintaining the capacity to instantly interdict illicit trade. For years, Washington calibrated its enforcement carefully, fully aware that an overly aggressive posture in the strait could easily spike global energy prices or trigger a wider regional conflict. The Shadow Fleet thrived in this specific area of calculated restraint, gambling that American forces would prioritize broader regional stability over the systematic interception of individual oil shipments bound for Asia. However, the geopolitical tolerance for this evasion has sharply deteriorated. The perception of the Shadow Fleet has fundamentally shifted from a minor nuisance into a direct, large-scale challenge to the integrity of global sanctions. By systematically cracking down on this bottleneck, the United States is no longer simply managing an economic containment strategy against Tehran. It is actively demonstrating its unyielding dominance over the maritime choke points that hold the global economy together. For the captains navigating these unmarked vessels, the psychological pressure of transiting the strait has intensified immensely. Knowing that you are attempting to quietly maneuver 250,000 tons of highly flammable, illegal cargo through the most intensely watched naval corridor on the planet forces a harsh reality. The physical constraints of the Strait of Hormuz mean that the shadow fleet's survival relies entirely on the political forbearance of the power that controls the waters. When that forbearance evaporates, the geographical bottleneck transforms rapidly from a busy transit route into a high-stakes, inescapable trap. The United States does not rely solely on the kinetic threat of warships to enforce its will. The modern blockade is not a continuous line of destroyers trading fire with smugglers. It is a sophisticated dual-pronged strategy that merges the physical dominance of the United States Navy with the immense, invisible leverage of the Treasury Department. It is the synchronized weaponization of both geography and the global financial system. On the water, the U.S. military employs unparalleled intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, capabilities. Rather than dramatic helicopter raids in the dead of night, the reality of maritime interdiction is highly bureaucratic and methodical. Every anomalous movement, every AIS blackout, and every suspicious ship-to-ship transfer is continuously logged. The Navy does not need to physically seize every single vessel. By simply maintaining a highly visible, heavily armed presence, they force the shadow fleet to take longer, riskier, and more expensive routes. The mere threat of interception is enough to deter massive supertankers, forcing them to abort their transit and retreat. But the most devastating component of this strategy happens thousands of miles away from the Persian Gulf, inside the offices of the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. Washington understands that the shadow fleet operates on razor-thin margins of risk and reward. If you cannot sink the ships, you sink their financial viability. OFAC systematically targets the sprawling networks of shell companies, shadowy ship management firms, and illicit financial facilitators that keep these tankers afloat. By aggressively sanctioning the vessels themselves, the United States effectively turns these multi-million-dollar assets into floating liabilities. Once a ship is publicly designated, it becomes toxic. It is immediately barred from accessing reputable dry docks for essential maintenance. It cannot legally source critical spare parts. More importantly, any port authority or coastal nation that allows the vessel to dock risks being entirely cut off from the U.S. dollar and the Western banking system. The financial quarantine is absolute. This dual approach creates a suffocating squeeze on Beijing's energy corridor. The Navy applies the physical pressure at the geographical choke point, forcing operators to make panicked errors or delay their shipments. OFAC then capitalizes on those delays, exposing the corporate structures behind the ships and aggressively stripping away their ability to conduct business. The combined effect dramatically inflates the operational costs for the shadow fleet. What was once a highly profitable, relatively low-risk smuggling operation suddenly requires exorbitant premiums for black market insurance, hazardous pay for crews, and highly complex money laundering schemes. For China, the implications are severe. The U.S. strategy does not require a declaration of war or a massive escalation of force. By surgically targeting the logistical and financial nodes of this illicit network, Washington is effectively placing a slow, tightening chokehold on the energy lifelines of its greatest strategic rival. It is a masterclass in modern economic warfare, demonstrating that control over the global financial architecture is just as lethal as control over the sea lanes. On paper, the People's Liberation Army Navy is a formidable force. In terms of sheer hull numbers, it is the largest maritime force on the planet, boasting a rapidly expanding fleet of advanced destroyers and newly launched aircraft carriers. But building warships is very different from projecting global security. The vast majority of China's maritime power is heavily concentrated close to its own shores, designed primarily to dominate the First Island chain and the South China Sea. Once you move beyond the protective umbrella of their land-based missile systems and push into the deep waters of the Indian Ocean, that overwhelming advantage quickly evaporates. For decades, military planners in Beijing have obsessed over what they call the Malacca dilemma, the terrifying realization that hostile forces could easily choke off their economy by blocking the narrow shipping lanes of Southeast Asia. But the aggressive enforcement actions in the Middle East prove that this nightmare has now extended thousands of miles westward. The transit from the Chinese mainland to the Gulf of Oman is a sprawling, unprotected logistics route entirely dominated by the United States and its regional allies. China's energy security is essentially out of its own hands. When an American guided missile destroyer tracks or deters a Chinese-linked supertanker near Hormuz, Beijing has absolutely no tactical recourse. They cannot simply dispatch a carrier strike group to the Persian Gulf to escort an illicit, sanction-evading oil shipment. While China does maintain a military logistics base in Djibouti on the Horn of Africa, it is far too small and geographically isolated to project meaningful, sustained combat power against the deeply entrenched architecture of the United States Fifth Fleet. On the open ocean, the Chinese state is practically powerless to defend its shadow fleet. This stark imbalance forces the Chinese leadership into a frustratingly passive posture. Unable to respond with hard power on the water, their reaction is confined entirely to diplomatic corridors. Foreign ministry officials in Beijing issue harsh statements, condemning the enforcement tactics as dangerous and irresponsible. They repeatedly appeal to the international community, arguing that global shipping lanes must remain free and unobstructed. But strongly worded press releases echoing through the halls of the United Nations do not alter the physical reality on the water. Diplomatic protests do not move American warships, and they certainly do not pump crude oil into empty tankers. The wider domestic consequences of this vulnerability are immediate and severe. The massive independent refineries scattered across China, which were explicitly built to process this cheap, heavily discounted Iranian crude, suddenly face crippling supply shocks. As tankers are delayed, tracked, or forced to abandon their routes entirely, the cost of doing business skyrockets, supply chains fracture, and the Chinese industrial machine is forced to drain its strategic petroleum reserves far faster than anticipated. This dynamic exposes a fundamental, inescapable truth about the modern geopolitical order. A nation cannot claim to be a complete, self-sustaining global superpower if it lacks the expeditionary capability to secure its own essential supply lines. As long as the United States Navy retains the unchallengeable ability to sever these vital energy arteries at will, Beijing will always remain in a state of strategic defense. But as China desperately scrambles to find alternative energy sources to plug this massive hole, they are forced to look away from the Middle East and turn their eyes north. And waiting for them is a supposed strategic partner who views this entire crisis not as a tragedy, but as an incredibly lucrative opportunity. On paper, Moscow and Tehran share a strategic partnership, united by their mutual opposition to Western hegemony and crippling sanctions. When the United States began systematically dismantling Iran's shadow fleet in the Middle East, the international community might have expected the Kremlin to step in, perhaps offering diplomatic cover, maritime escorts, or aggressive pushback in the United Nations. But in the ruthless calculus of great power competition, states do not have friends, they only have interests, and the Russian state is putting everything on the board to turn this crisis entirely in its favor. As the flow of Iranian crude through the Strait of Hormuz effectively dries up, a massive multi-billion-dollar vacuum has opened in the Chinese energy market. Beijing's independent refineries, desperate to keep their operations running, can no longer rely on the unpredictable and highly targeted shadow fleet. They need a massive, immediate, and relatively safe influx of crude oil. This is precisely where the Russian energy sector steps in. Unburdened by the geographic trap of the Persian Gulf, Russian oil companies operate through entirely different logistical corridors. They can pump crude through the massive East Siberia-Pacific Ocean pipeline network directly into northern China, or they can load tankers from safe, highly secured northern ports far removed from the reach of the United States Fifth Fleet. The Kremlin realized immediately that Iran's geopolitical crisis was, in reality, a miraculous economic windfall for Moscow. Instead of aiding their supposed ally in Tehran, Russia has ruthlessly capitalized on their misfortune. By aggressively stepping into the void left by the disrupted Iranian shipments, Russian oil firms have rapidly captured an enormous share of the Chinese market. They are supplying the desperately needed energy, but they are doing so while dictating the volume and the pricing structure. This calculated pragmatism is yielding staggering dividends. At a moment when the Russian economy is under immense pressure from the staggering costs of the war in Ukraine, this sudden surge in Asian demand serves as a vital financial lifeline. By filling the gap left by the American maritime squeeze on Iran, the Russian state is securing billions of dollars in unexpected critical revenue. This massive capital flow is quietly funding the Kremlin's war machine, injected directly into their defense industrial base. While Russian diplomats may occasionally issue mild statements condemning American overreach in the Middle East, the reality on the ground is entirely different. Moscow has completely abandoned Tehran to its fate in the Strait of Hormuz, perfectly content to watch their supposed partner suffocate under the weight of American naval deterrence. They know that every Chinese tanker forced to turn around in the Gulf of Oman ultimately makes Beijing more heavily dependent on Russian energy. This dynamic brutally exposes the transactional reality of the new authoritarian bloc. It proves that despite the diplomatic rhetoric of no-limits partnerships, these alliances are fundamentally fragile, held together only by convenience and immediate profit. But as Russia quietly counts its unexpected billions, there is another, perhaps more surprising victor emerging from this geopolitical chaos, and they happen to be the very architects of the blockade itself. The ultimate irony of this maritime confrontation is that the very architect of the blockade is also its greatest economic beneficiary. While the crackdown in the Middle East has triggered immense logistical panic in Beijing and financial desperation in Tehran, it has quietly ushered in a highly lucrative era for the American energy sector. By systematically restricting the flow of illicit Iranian crude, the United States has engineered a massive supply vacuum in the global market, a vacuum that Washington is uniquely positioned to fill. When hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil are suddenly trapped behind a wall of naval deterrence, global supply tightens. Buyers who traditionally relied on the Persian Gulf to keep their industries running are forced to seek stable, secure alternatives. The American oil and gas industry, already operating at historic levels of production, has seamlessly absorbed this sudden surge in international demand. The physical contrast between the two maritime regions is stark. While illicit supertankers idle helplessly in the Gulf of Oman, fearing financial interdiction and military tracking, export terminals along the Gulf Coast are experiencing an unprecedented boom. Deepwater ports from Houston to Corpus Christi are operating at peak capacity. Massive, very large crude carriers are lining up in broad daylight along the Texas coastline, safely loading millions of barrels of American crude and sailing freely into international waters without the need for disabled transponders or black market insurance. This dynamic transforms a standard military containment strategy into a compounding economic victory. For decades, the United States was heavily dependent on the Middle East for its own energy security, remaining vulnerable to regional supply shocks. Today, that paradigm has been entirely inverted. The Washington administration is effectively suffocating the revenue streams of its geopolitical adversaries while simultaneously injecting billions of dollars directly into its own domestic economy. Every barrel of Iranian oil that the U.S. Navy keeps off the water translates to increased market share, export volume, and pricing power for American producers. It is a masterful demonstration of leveraging structural advantage. The United States has weaponized its dual status as the world's preeminent naval power and the world's leading oil producer. They are not merely policing the global order. They are actively dictating the terms of the global energy market, turning the strategic risks of their rivals into a massive American dividend. This reality forces a harsh reckoning for nations attempting to operate outside the established system, and it points directly to how the future of global power will actually be contested. The ongoing silent war in the Strait of Hormuz is about much more than a few million barrels of smuggled oil. It is a definitive demonstration of how the future of global power will actually be contested. We are moving away from an era defined by massive kinetic land wars and entering a period where economic choke points, naval deterrence, and financial architecture are the primary weapons of statecraft. Beijing has successfully built the most formidable industrial engine in human history. Yet, this entire crisis brutally exposes the absolute ceiling of that power. A nation can manufacture a massive fleet of commercial vessels and build sprawling state-of-the-art port infrastructure, but if it lacks the deep-water naval capacity to protect its critical supply lines thousands of miles from its shores, its economy remains fundamentally vulnerable. As long as the United States and its allies maintain undeniable control over the global maritime commons and the international banking system, China will be forced to play a perpetual game of strategic defense. The shadow fleet will undoubtedly adapt. They will seek out new black market insurance structures, attempt more complex digital spoofing, and look for alternative, costlier transit routes. But the harsh physical reality of the ocean cannot be rewritten. The power that actively controls the sea lanes inevitably dictates the destiny of the nations that rely on them. Looking ahead, do you think Beijing can ever achieve true energy independence in the next decade? Or will their industrial machine remain permanently trapped by geography? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. and thank you for watching.